As you may recall, this whole one-sided conversation began when Ken Wheeler put this picture up against this picture and claimed that the picture on the right was right and the picture on the left was wrong. Of course, the picture on the right is right because this is a real picture of a real ferrocell under the influence of a real magnet. So there is no doubt that the figure on the right is right, obviously. But what about the image on the left? Just because the image on the right is right, does this mean that the image on the left is wrong? To show you the flaw in this logic, I'm going to show you two more pictures. Now, what if I told you the image on the right is right and the image on the left is wrong? What would you say? The image on the right is an orange and the image on the left is an apple. Since the apple does not look anything like an orange, then the apple must be wrong, right? Now you see how silly that sounds. What I'm trying to say is, comparing the Steinmetz one-wire diagram to the north/south pole of a ferrocell image is like comparing apples to oranges. The only thing similar between apples and oranges is that they are both fruit. And the only thing similar between the image on the right and the diagram on the left is they both correspond to field geometries. Only the field geometry on the left is the geometry of an apple, and the field geometry on the right is the geometry of an orange. Apples and oranges both exist. In a similar manner, I argue that both of these field geometries exist in nature. I've seen it with my own eyes, and so I know that this is true. Either that or Mother Nature forgot to tell the spider that this field geometry does not exist. This is how it works for the spider. First, the spider puts out several radial lines of tension. Then the spider places the circular lines of pressure. Finally, the spider sits right in the middle and touches each of its 8 legs to a line of tension of the web. And then she waits. When a bug flies into the web, some of the lines of tension get perturbed. Based on which leg feels the perturbation, the spider then knows exactly which direction to go to get the bug. You see, Mother Nature does create this field geometry, and it turns out to be quite useful. So back to this picture. The image on the left is a cross-section of the field geometry surrounding a single wire with current flowing through it. And the image on the right is the field geometry of a north or south pole of a magnet under the influence of a ferrocell. They do not depict the same thing. The image on the right is from the perspective of a north pole or a south pole, and the image on the left does not correspond to a pole. In fact, in the single linear wire with current flowing through it, there are no poles. In a previous video, I showed you this picture. When you place a compass near a wire with current flowing through it, you see that each compass aligns with the circular magnetic lines of pressure. As far as I understand it, the compasses will never turn and line themselves up with the wire. They're only ever going to line themselves up with the magnetic lines of pressure. And the magnetic lines of pressure are always orthogonal to the direction of motion of the charges in the wire. But one of my viewers raised a good question. What is happening to the magnetic field along the wire itself as the current is moving through the wire? It is commonly thought that the magnetic field forms concentric circles around the wire, something like this. But it is also possible that the magnetic field forms a helix wave like we saw in my previous video on complex numbers. Remember, helix waves are kind of like springs. If magnetic field lines form a helix wave while current is flowing through the wire, then what would this look like when viewed from the perspective of the cross-section of the wire? My viewer thought that we would see the hypertrophic pattern like we see in the Ferro cell, and I thought differently. To test this, I wrote a little computer program to generate this field geometry. The beauty of being a computer programmer is that I can write my own programs and test my own theories. The first program I wrote was of a single spring with a line going through it. The line represents a single wire with current flowing through it. As you can see, when you rotate the spring so that we're looking at a cross-section of the wire, you see a circle and not a hypertrophic pattern. But this doesn't account for the fact that the magnetic lines of pressure are radiating away from the wire. The next program I wrote was to show several springs of different sizes with the thought that this would generate the hypertrophic pattern. Here you can see the nice sinusoidal wave pattern of the helix wave. Now, when you look at this from the perspective of the cross-section of the wire, you see only concentric circles and no hypertrophic pattern. So this got me thinking. If this is the formula of the helix wave, then what is the formula for the hypertrophic pattern that we see in the Ferro cell? My first thought was this: when you take a loop of wire and pass a current through it, you do get a north and a south pole. A single straight wire with current flowing through it has no poles. But when you loop the wire into a spring, you get poles. In this diagram, when the current is moving counterclockwise through the coil, you get a south pole. And when the current is moving clockwise through the coil, you get a north pole. The magnetic lines of pressure radiate around the wire as seen here. So if the magnetic lines of pressure form a helix wave instead of concentric circles, then what kind of magnetic field pattern is going to form? As a first approximation, I thought it would be very close to a circular spring, that is, a spring with both ends attached to each other. So I wrote a program to generate a circular spring. So here is the circular spring I created. You'll have to imagine that there is a single loop of wire on the inside of this circular spring. Although this kind of looks like a hypertrophic pattern, it is not exactly right. As you can see, when I tilt the circular spring, it starts to look like a hypertrophic pattern, but the image on the right is looking straight on and not from an angle. However, when you look at it from the side, it does kind of look like the dielectric inertial plane of a magnet as seen under a Ferro cell. So I think we're close, but no cigar. I want to see the hypertrophic pattern. In the previous slide, I made the inner radius smaller than the outer radius. So I thought, what if I make the inner radius bigger than the outer radius? So this is what I did. As you can see, it still does not look like a hypertrophoid, but it does seem to look more like a Toro flux. But it's still not the same because unlike the Toro flux, these two ends seem to be meshed together. It doesn't seem like they can come apart, like in the Toro flux. I wanted to write the program to make a Toro flux to see if it creates the hypertrophic pattern. So I did some digging and discovered that the Toro flux is a torus knot. Here is the equation set for a torus knot. Notice that it also involves the orthogonal sine and cosine functions. When I plug this set of equations into my program, I get the following. Now we have something that looks exactly like the hypertrophoid pattern as seen in the Ferro cell. And as you rotate this around, you get that holographic effect that you get on the Ferro cell as you move the magnet around. Looking at this geometry from the side, you can see that this also has the geometry of the Toro flux. However, the side view does not appear to have the geometry of the dielectric inertial plane of the magnet as seen under the Ferro cell. So, more work needs to be done to try to find the geometry that mimics both the field geometry of the north and south poles and the field geometry of the dielectric inertial plane of the magnet as seen under the Ferro cell. Here is a paper I found that I would like to draw your attention to. This paper shows a dual Toro flux geometry with a dielectric inertial plane in the middle. This is a good paper to read if you want to understand more about what's going on inside the Ferro cell, or Ferro lens as they call it in this paper. Now back to this picture. As I said earlier, there is nothing wrong with the picture on the left. This is the field geometry of a cross-section of a wire with current flowing through it. A single wire with current flowing through it has no poles. Therefore, it cannot and does not exhibit the hypertrophoid pattern of a north and south pole as seen in this image. This is the last time I will be talking about this particular subject. That said, this line of thinking did lead me to the equation for the Toro flux, which is very close to the field geometry of the magnet, as Ken argues many times in his videos. So Ken is definitely right about that. That all said, I did find something interesting in one of Steinmetz's books called Alternating Current Phenomenon. In Chapter 5, I was excited to see his use of imaginary numbers in his treatment of voltage, current, and impedance. He does say something, however, that is not quite right. Here, he says that the imaginary unit J has no numerical meaning in the system of ordinary numbers. In electrical engineering, they use J instead of I for imaginary, since I is the symbol reserved for current. So when Steinmetz says J, he means I, or J squared equals -1. However, as I showed in my previous video on complex numbers, the imaginary unit, which we will now call J, has an exact numerical meaning when you notate it using a two-dimensional matrix. Remember that the complex number contains both the real component on the forward diagonal and the imaginary component on the backward diagonal. The units of the imaginary numbers in electrical engineering notation are J and -J. Both J squared and -J squared are equal to the scalar -1. So Steinmetz is wrong in that J does have numerical meaning. It has numerical meaning when you correctly implement the complex numbers as a two-dimensional 2x2 matrix. J has ponderable meaning when expressed like this. J is the rotation component of a two-dimensional 2x2 matrix. This is why imaginary numbers are associated with rotation. So, Steinmetz is right, and Steinmetz is wrong, and Ken is right, and Ken is wrong. and I am right, and yes, sometimes I am wrong. But that is not the point of these videos. The point of these videos is to try to understand the missing secrets of magnetism and gravity and electricity. As you will see, this way of notating complex numbers is going to greatly simplify our ability to understand the missing secrets of all these things.